I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming on Netflix or Amazon Prime.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the hook, plot, characters, and ending to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back,
relax,
and enjoy Stream On. Today we'll be reviewing Spring, streaming on Tubi.
Boy goes to Italy. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl fall for each other. Girl turns out to be a Lovecraftian mutant. Romance is in the air.
Spring was directed by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, and it was written by Justin Benson. It stars Lou Taylor Pucci as Evan, a man who is drifting through Italy after his mother died, trying to find himself, and Nadia Hilker as Louise, a beautiful, mysterious woman who Evan meets in his Italian travels. So, Jeff, you chose this film. Why did you pick Spring?
I had 3 reasons. The first one is I like Lovecraft movies, whether they are directly based on a work by Lovecraft or, in this case, more inspired by and with the tone of a Lovecraft story. When I first heard about this film, it was actually through a interview that Guillermo del Toro did, where he said that it was the best horror film in decades, and it was the only Lovecraftian film that had blown him away. So I was like, okay, this should be interesting to watch. And finally, I like hybrid romances. I'm not a particular fan of traditional romances, but I do like hybrid romances, cross-genre films. This is a good one. Films like Miracle Mile, or even Shaun of the Dead, where you take the trappings of another genre and drop romance into it, those tend to appeal to me. So those are the reasons why.
Also, we're close to Valentine's Day, so we wanted to choose a romance for that reason, and you got to pick this one. I probably would have chosen like a rom-com or something, so definitely a different feel than that.
Yes, the listeners can thank me. So, Steph, what did this film remind you of?
So I chose the sci-fi film Under the Skin starring Scarlett Johansson. And so there are a few parallels that Under the Skin has with Spring. I would say the primary one is that both films deal with a creature hiding in the shell of a beautiful female. And so in Under the Skin, the creature is an alien from another dimension. And in Spring, the creature is more of a genetic mutant. But it's the idea of you have the hapless human man that is lured in by this beautiful woman, and he has no idea the monster that's hiding underneath. And so the women have ulterior motives. It's not just about the man's well-being. They have something else that they are trying to accomplish. And Under the Skin, the alien needs a food source, and it becomes these men. In Spring, the monster needs the sperm of the man to rebirth herself. But they both are really using their beauty and their feminine wiles and the disguise of a beautiful woman to achieve their goals. And the man is manipulated in the process. So that's where I saw those parallels. Jeff, what did you choose?
So I chose Let the Right One In, a 2008 Swedish horror romance coming-of-age story. The film has a very similar tone in which you have an emotionally damaged human meeting up with an element of the horrific and supernatural that provides emotional connections that he's otherwise missing. It also has a very similar setting. The setting is very real-world, gritty, realistic, and then you have this element of the fantastic inserting itself into that world. And the ending is very similar too, where the human finds out that the object of his desire, in the case of Let the Right One, a vampire, he finds out what she is, and it doesn't matter because that emotional connection overrides any sort of horror at this thing being a air quotes monster. So yeah, that was the movie I immediately went to when I saw this.
It's a good movie. I like the Swedish version better than the American version, personally.
The remake is fine. It's one of those remakes that I think actually works. It maintains some of the similar themes. My problem with the remake is that it doesn't really seem necessary. The first film was just really good as it is.
Right. It's like when they tried to remake Rebecca. Fail. Okay, Jeff. So tell us about The Hook. What did you like? What did you not like? Did it grab you in the first 15 minutes?
The Hook, I thought, worked very well. It sets up Evan. It gives him a significant amount of emotional backstory. We get a good sense of what his life is like in California, which is where the film starts. We have an extremely dramatic, life-changing scene at the beginning of the film where Evan is present at his mother's death, and he's the only person there. She just dies while he's sitting by her bedside. We have a series of events that are motivating for him to leave the United States and not be able to come back. Basically a bar fight, police get involved, and he has to flee the country. It all works for giving him a good motive for having to leave the United States to go to Italy. It gives him emotional baggage and trauma that he has to overcome. It shows that his life is a wreck. His parents are dead. He has a trauma of watching his mom die. His life is basically at a dead end. So it leaves him open for a radical shift that actually comes across as being realistic. Once we're in Italy, it gets a little fuzzier. He hooks up with a couple of English lads on holiday who seem a bit more like caricatures than characters. And they are literally there to get him from point A to point B and then leave him in point B. I didn't think that was necessary. The big problem with The Hook is that the other main character, Louise, gets very little backstory within the context of that opening segment. It's really Evan's story, and it does a good job of setting him up, and then The Hook basically ends when we're introduced to Louise. So it works. It drew me in and was engaging, but it's definitely weighted towards one character over the other. So what did you think?
So for me, The Hook did its job pretty well. I would say some of the things I liked about The Hook is we got Evan's primary motive. So to your point, he's dealing with grief after his mom dies. His dad is already dead. His life's going nowhere. He's that loser friend. Multiple people. I mean, it's a little bit like hitting us over the head, but multiple people are saying, hey, you need to get out of town. Why don't you go travel, recenter yourself? I mean, we can tell that's what's going to happen because several different people tell him to do it. And he does. And so then he's in Italy. I didn't have a problem with the two plot device European guys that he meets at the hostel. I get that they were very plotty, but there was some fun banter between them. And they gave Evan like a kick in the butt to actually travel more into the depths of Italy. You have the beautiful scene where they're driving along the Italian coast. That was well shot. They serve their purpose, right? I mean, once he gets to the smaller Italian town and he sees Louise and has some banter with her at the bar, they basically decide they're going to go to Amsterdam, leave, and that's where The Hook ends. So you're right, they get Evan from point A to point B, but I don't think it was a bad way to do it. They set him up to be drifting and lost and needing the direction of other people, and these guys gave him that call to adventure. The main thing I did not like about The Hook is there's this long slow mo scene where Evan is going into this Italian village. It's with him and his two European buddies that he met, and he spots Louise for the first time, and she's beautiful walking through the town, and it's like guy sees beautiful girl and they slow everything down. I am not a huge fan of slow mo except in very rare circumstances. I think that it should be used extremely judiciously in films. The Matrix is a good example where slow mo works, as Neo's navigating the bullets, right? But this, I did not feel the slow mo was necessary. You could have just had them walking through the village, and he spots the beautiful woman and moves on. And that was the one thing that bugged me about the hook, is that unnecessary use of slow mo. Well, other than that, I thought it did its job.
See, I thought that scene worked really well. The slow mo walk through that square, and the way it's shot, the way we see that Evan is in shadow until he sees Louise and turns to look at her and her face is hit by the sunlight, that's an indicator that you are passing from a very reality-based world into a more fantasy-based world. Up until that moment, this film, particularly the scene set in California, could have been any low-level, gritty urban drama, even like an American History X or something. Not in the story being told, but in the feel of the film. That slow motion is an indication that you are leaving that world and heading into something that's not based as much on reality and it's a bit more fantasy. And the fact that she's sitting there in that vibrant red dress and looks like a fantasy figure adds to that. And I think the slow-mo works because it's saying the rules are changing. And that's how I read into that scene. If you didn't read that into the scene, you could see it as being like, well, why are they even doing this? He's just walking through a square and sees this chick. Why bother with the slow motion, that kind of artificiality that changing the speed that you're presenting your film at creates? And that's why I thought it worked, because there is a purpose to it. And that after that, the movie starts to really get into the fantastic elements and leaves some of that grittiness behind.
Yeah, so I did not read that as a through the looking glass moment, which is why the slow mo didn't work for me. And organically, the fantastical develops in this film. I don't think you needed to cue the viewer that was happening in that moment. I liked more of the organic development of the fantastical elements.
So, leaving the hook behind, what did you find worked and did not work with the plot?
So there's one thing I really want to focus on that I felt did not work in this film, was the romance that was set up between Evan and Louise. So I felt that the actors did a good job with their chemistry. It was not an issue with their acting. The dialogue at times was very witty. There was some fun scenes where, like, a cute first date where you could tell there was great chemistry, and it was witty screenwriting back and forth. So none of that was the issue. The problem is that Evan is not set up to be a particularly interesting character. They do spend, the majority of the hook giving him some depth because he's got grief over the loss of his mom and his life is going nowhere, but he's not anything special. He's dealing with some loss, which many people deal with. He's got that one loser friend that he leaves behind when he goes to Italy. He's drifting through life with not a clear sense of direction. He's trying to find himself in this small Italian village. And then he meets this really interesting, stunning, beautiful woman that's like out of his league, Louise. And as we find out as the film progresses, Louise is a 2,000-year-old immortal mutant. and has been in many relationships over her 2,000 years of existence. She's extremely intelligent. She's got this mutation, they call it hereditary heterochromia, where basically every 20 years she finds a sperm donor and rebirths herself as her daughter, with half of her DNA and then the sperm donor's DNA. But she doesn't rebirth as a child, she rebirths as a woman in like her 20s. And so that's how she maintains her immortality, is this constant cycle of rebirth every 20 years. And she just, finds that hapless man to be the sperm donor and uses men to do that. And so weird, this film is basically saying that Evan is the one that within 7 days of knowing this guy, she falls in love with him, and he's the one that's going to override this rebirth cycle that's 2,000 years old. Again, every 20 years that she does. I just don't buy it. Like, they didn't give enough time for the romance to develop. They didn't make Evan an interesting enough guy that she is going to do that. I mean, this is classic wish fulfillment, where an ordinary guy ends up with an extraordinary girl way out of his league, and for some unknown reason is able to win her over. And that is what really bugged me about the romance, and this film lost points for me because of that. Jeff, what are your thoughts about that?
I agree with elements of your criticism. I disagree that Evan is not an interesting enough or likable enough or complex enough character to plausibly cause Louise to have feelings for him beyond just using him for genetic material. Where I agree with your criticism has to do with the length of time the relationship is going on, which we are told is 5 days. With everything we see them doing in the first 2 acts, that doesn't make logical sense. We see them doing a lot of things. We see them going out on multiple dates. We see him getting a job with a local farmer and apparently becoming pretty good friends with this guy all in the space of a week. I'm willing to accept compressed timelines in a story, but with everything we see him doing and with the developments that we see in his interactions with those 2 characters, it is implied that a lot more time has passed. Now, not years, but it seems like weeks or months have gone by. The other problem with the relationship is an issue of phasing. And what I mean by that is that there is a road trip at the end of the movie, which works sort of to give the characters a bit more time to have some meaningful interactions, and there's some light comedy. The problem is where it is in the film doesn't make much sense. It should have been a lot earlier in the film. And this is where the phasing comment comes in. This movie needed to follow kind of a drama curve. Kind of start someplace, have the relationship develop in more of a romantic comedy form, and then get very serious near the end. But that third act, the tone is really messed up. And then it gets back to what you're saying, is that we are told by Louise, and it's unclear how she knows this or why she knows this, but let's just accept she knows that when she falls in love with someone, she'll stop regenerating. And she apparently does that for Evan. I know we'll get into that at the ending, but it's kind of germane here. There's not enough build-up to accept that. I don't think it's an issue with the chemistry between the 2 characters or even how Evan is set up. It's just with that timing issue and the weird tone at the end, it's just not believable. And I'm saying not believable, a film with a character who turns into a squid monster. So there you go.
Right. It's a classic like fairy tale of love conquers all and Beauty and the Beast style. The kiss is going to lift the curse, if we think of her immortality as even a curse. But yeah, the compressed time of 5 to 7 day window is, it doesn't work in this film. And the film, even the way they have the scenes, it makes you feel like much more time has gone by than what really has.
Well, you mentioned, the whole idea of her condition being a curse. That's not how it's presented in the film, though. She doesn't seem to be particularly upset. She doesn't, like, near the end of her life cycle, turning into hybrid monsters and eating cats and stuff. But it's not presented like she's in agony over this long life that she's had. In fact, she states a number of times, "Why would I give up immortality for you?"
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't think she sees it as a curse either. It's just they play on that trope of love conquering all and changing, maybe curse isn't the right word, but doing something to shift the circumstances that the person has been put in. It's very fairy tale esque in that way.
This movie would have worked better if her condition was presented as a curse. If she clearly was not just uncomfortable with elements of it, like changing into these hybrid creatures, which she clearly doesn't like. If there had been some moment in the movie where she had made it clear that she's tired of this eternal existence, then you could justify what happens at the end a bit more.
So I did a rewrite and I went another way with it. So what I thought would be interesting is, so we have a scene that Louise and Evan are having sex, and she comes on to him really strong in the beginning. Like, basically, the first time they meet, she's, let's let's go to the hotel room type deal, right? It's very much come with me, and you can tell she wants to sleep with him. So it's like really, really, really strong. And he buys it, right? He resists at first, and then they go on the date, and then he gets hooked in pretty quickly, and so they have sex, and we purposely see her ditching the condom, obviously, because she is trying to get his sperm for the rebirth process. And so it sets her up to be this cunning, manipulative monster woman, right? So I think you should keep going with that angle. Like, have Louise continue to be cunning and lure Evan in, so that he thinks he's falling in love with her. And then in the end, when she does her rebirth process and she turns into the monster, she ends up devouring Evan, because we see that she's eating creatures, right? She becomes, it's like she needs to have creatures to survive, like different animals and that kind of thing. She eats them raw as she gets closer to her cycle. Like, she needs that blood. So I thought that would be more interesting, is for Evan to think he's really falling in love with her and she's tricking him, and in the end he gets devoured by her, and we get to actually see her morphing into the Lovecraftian monster in all its glory. We never 100% get to see that when the rebirth happens. Like, the film cheats us out of that at the end, and I think it would have been cool to actually see that. But instead, the film dumbs down this 2,000-year-old, interesting, mutant, brilliant woman and turns her into someone that's going to fall in love with a rando guy in 7 days and break her cycle of rebirth. So, yeah, just disappointing.
I think this movie would have worked better as a tragic romance or a doomed romance. I'm not certain if I'd go as far as you and have Louise eating Evan. I do agree, though, that the end has her making basically an unreasonable emotional connection to this guy that she just met, and an emotional connection that she apparently has been able to resist for 2,000 years. So we can keep most of the story as is. It just, in my own particular rewrite, would have our fun road trip is the second act, and the third act is her deteriorating in the sense of becoming more of this hybrid monster chick. And then it ends either with him fleeing, sad, but a little wiser. Or if you wanted something maybe a little more either upbeat or creepy, it ends with him encountering her after she's regenerated. And just have like a kind of a creepy moment of meeting this woman that he clearly recognizes.
Right, because he sees the eyes still, right? Because she's got one brown and one green eye. That's like the cue that it's still her. She always has the two different eyes. And so he could see another woman that looks like that with those eyes, and there's that knowledge. Not quite as like grotesque as, I don't know why I love the idea of, as part of her rebirth, she has to eat the guy that was the sperm donor. Maybe that says something about me, but I just think that that would be, if we're going to go more horror with this movie, that would be a better horror ending. But if we're not going to go creepy horror all the way, then I think your ending could work as well. But either way, we needed more tragedy. The ending was too artificial, too happy. Definitely agree with you on that one.
And a lot of it, to me, just gets back to, and this is where we do differ, it's not so much the Evan character, it's just that we are presented with a timeline that doesn't make sense. And this is where the writer hat comes on. We want our plotting to make sense. We want the events that our characters go through to seem to unfold in a natural, believable manner. It is, in general, a tough sell to say that not even that two people who just meet have an instant attraction, because that's believable and people can relate to that. But this is like a life-altering, in Louise's case, literally an altering of her life cycle event that takes place in under a week. And it's particularly problematic because, as we both pointed out, the way this film is presented, it sure seems to take longer.
Agreed. It's okay to have fantastical plots and storylines, but your world building has to make sense internally to that plot. And yeah, this one does not in terms of the romance. I think where writers go wrong sometimes is because they're asking the viewer or the reader to suspend disbelief in one area, they think that they can get you to suspend disbelief in another area. And that doesn't always work. That's cheating. You can't do that and still write a good story. Just because I'm suspending disbelief that this rebirth cycle happens and there's this female mutant out there doesn't mean I'm also going to suspend disbelief and think that you can have a romance in 7 days it's going to break a 2,000-year-old cycle. So is there anything else about the plot, Jeff, that you wanted to call out?
There actually were a couple of things I wanted to bring up. One thing that the creative team did very well was using the environment to set the mood. As a storyteller, there are different tools you can use to guide your reader into how they should feel about something. You can just kind of blurt things out, or you could do what this film does very well and have little moments happening in the background that really hammer some of the themes and also create a palpably creepy environment. We see a lot of stuff of kind of a life-death cycle going on in the background with like insects eating each other. There's a scene where Evan is wandering through the countrysides and comes across a sheep carcass with a snake worming its way through the skull. There's a lot of stuff with like flowers blooming and dying, generally around Louise because of some effect she has on them. But it really reinforces this idea that Evan is in this kind of pit of seething nature and that there is this life-death cycle that he is now immersed in and that she is at the center of. It also was a smart idea to set this in a town that has a lot of like ruins and has a museum and it has like the older buildings. This idea that he has stepped into a place with deep history, an environment where history goes back thousands of years. So I actually thought that as far as using visuals to reinforce certain tones and themes worked really well with this film. It was very well done. I did have in my notes some places like a little question to myself, like, do they do too much of this? At the end, I decided, no, it works, but we do get a lot of little scenes, like I said, of insects eating each other and things like that. So, did all that work for you?
It did, and I can see why Del Toro liked the movie for that reason because visually it is beautiful, even if it's like the creepy and macabre type of beautiful, it is well shot, and I liked those scenes to help continue to set that Lovecraftian tone and the creepy and the organic, right? Because it's really getting going for like a bio creepy feel versus like ghost goblin feel. And so yeah, I thought they did that well. I also love some of the beautiful moments that really capture Italy. Like there's a romantic scene where they go into a sea cave and it's beautiful. Like that, it's one of the best shot scenes I think in the film, and all the scenes where they're sitting outside cafe style with the sea and the cliff below them is those are really nice. You can the film does a good enough job setting the mood that you can feel like you're there in Italy with these characters experiencing the siestas with them, and that is definitely the film's strong suit in my opinion.
The other issue that I wanted to bring up has to do with world building. That is, particularly for those of us who like to write in the genres of the fantastic, horror, science fiction, fantasy, setting up the rules of the world is a very important part of how you develop your story. There are two basic ways in film to set up the rules. You either do it through exposition or demonstration. What's interesting about this movie is they try to do both of those, and the two don't mesh up very well. Early on, we get a lot of demonstration moments. We see her partially change. We see that Louise needs to take some sort of injection to stabilize. We very early on get the impression that she is, if not immortal, at least thousands of years old, because we see a part of a Roman painting in a museum that shows a woman with the same eye condition she has, and it is clear that it's either her or part of whatever mutant offshoot of humanity she is. But all these things in the first and second act take place without her explaining things to Evan. They just happen. And as the viewer, you're like, okay, this is how this world works. The problem is that in the third act, this movie leans heavily into her trying to come up with some pseudo-scientific explanation of what's happening to her. I didn't think that worked. I thought it worked much better when we were just kind of piecing stuff together.
Yeah, there's this scene in the third act where they're walking through the town and Evan's kind of following her, asking questions, and she's giving him this giant exposition dump of how this all works over the last 2000 years, and it's a lot to take in the third act because that's not how the movie drip fed us in the first two acts. And I didn't like that either. I don't think you needed all of that pseudoscience, big exposition dump in Act Three to get. I mean, she could have gotten at it. It still explained the whole rebirth thing, but she didn't need to go into all those details because it wasn't that type of film. It wasn't set up to be like hard sci-fi elements film. So
the moment to have had her do a more natural exposition dump. And exposition dumps are not bad in and of themselves. It's how you work into the story. The natural point to have that happen in the rewrite in my head is if you have a second act road trip that ends at Pompeii, because that happens in the third act, and she shows Evan where her family died, which is a good moment. I like that scene. But if that had been like the high point of your second act, and that's where she says, "This is my mother. She had the same condition. I survived this," or whatever, "and I've been alive since then, and this is what I have to do." And then dropped all this stuff about brain chemistry and everything like that. I think that would have worked. It would have kind of tied up any loose ends a viewer might have when they're trying to piecing out how the world works, but not gotten into a bunch of gobbledygook. And that's what kind of leads off the third act. Yeah, you have these sequences where she's just rambling about the science behind what's happening to her. And then it also leads to real questions about how she figured any of this out, because as far as we know, other than her mother who's been dead for 2,000 years, she's unique. How does she know anything about how different changes in her biochemistry are going to affect her?
Right, and the problem with starting to go down the science route to try to explain everything to the watcher about how the world works and how her condition works is that it leads to more questions that the film doesn't answer. Like, one question I had is, if she is rebirthed every 20 years as someone that's like in her mid 20s, could she die? Like are there other ways to kill her? Like, yeah, she has this regenerative thing, but what if she is beheaded or something? Or what if she is like aren't there ways? Obviously her mother died in the volcano, like when the lava, petrified her. So is that the only way to kill her, is through lava? Or like it leaves that question unanswered. Can she die in that 20-year span, and how? And why hasn't she, if that's the case? And then the other thing is this whole volcano thing, because you have the volcano when her mom died at Pompeii, but then you have the volcano going off at the end of the film as she's rebirthing. Like, what does this tie into volcanoes? Is every 20 years when she rebirths, does a volcano erupt? Doesn't really answer that either. So it just leaves more questions that I'd rather have just been mysterious about, because it wasn't in essence to the core of your film to know all of the scientific reasons for this. So Jeff, anything else about the plot you wanted to point out?
Yes, just one sequence that bothered me a lot, and that was the ugly American section. It's like in the second act, our relationship between Evan and Louise is going along nicely, and some American tourists show up, and they are the most over-the-top caricatures of, the loud, obnoxious American tourist who apparently one of them doesn't even realize what country he's in. It seems like the filmmakers just wanted to have Louise kill the dude. That their whole storyline, such as it is, ends with one of these guys approaching her in an alleyway while she's starting to change. And he thinks she's a prostitute and then is going to assault her, and then she kills him. It seemed like the writers were just like, well, we need to get a kill in here to show how dangerous she is. So let's take these really over-the-top caricatures and throw them into this movie that, for the most part, even including the English lads from the first act, manages not to do that with any of the other characters. And it was really jarring.
I agree. It was like they were trying to make a point about douchebag American tourists coming into a country and not appreciating the culture and not having manners. And that's not this film. They could have just picked a random villager to kill. Or if you wanted to make it more personal, you could kill the farmer that Evan had gotten to know. Like they should have picked somebody that was already there versus bringing in a douchebag American tourist. It did pull you out of the film. So let's wrap this up. What are your thoughts about how this film ended, Jeff?
I thought the ending didn't really work very well. There were some nice moments. I found the entire Pompeii section to be actually fairly touching and created an interesting backstory for the character, which, as I mentioned earlier, probably would have worked better in the second act. The big problem with the ending is goes back to how truncated the timeline is and the monumental change Louise is supposed to make, while it is a romance trope, didn't really work with what I thought the tone of this movie was going to be. It just gets very, not even tropey, it gets stereotypical at the end. And it just didn't fit the rest of the film. And I think that's a big problem with the end of this movie. It doesn't fit. This movie either needed, you know, your more gruesome ending with her chowing down on Evan, or my less gruesome but still kind of tragic ending with him either fleeing in terror as she becomes this heaving mound of tentacles that pops out a new woman, or with him meeting her in a street sometime later. Overall, I'd say the ending didn't work. It went from a fairly believable and interesting relationship between these characters set in a world where you have that veneer of reality and then this weirdness happening under it, to cliches. Yeah, and that bothered me. So no, I don't think the ending worked very well.
Agreed. We are definitely aligned on this. The only thing I liked about the ending, which is the scene you called out, is the Pompeii scene at the end where the two of them are together and that we're seeing the volcano starting to smoke in the distance. And there's this tell me about the finite. Like Luis wants to understand what the finite world is like, and Evan explains what it's like to be human and to have those fragile emotional moments of being human, and how that is both tragic but also beautiful at the same time. And it's very well written what Evan says about being human, and so I do want to call that out from a writing perspective. I loved that dialogue, but everything else sucked. The movie shortchanged us. I felt completely cheated. It's this ambiguous ending with a volcano smoking, and we don't even get to see her transform. We just have that tell me about the finite moment and cut. And that is frustrating. Like, I wanted to see her rebirth happen. At least give us that. You spent the whole movie building up to it, and we didn't get to see the monster rebirth. Have some cool special effects. Maybe they run out of budget, and so they didn't have enough money to do the cool rebirth special effect. But I felt cheated to not get to see that scene. Like I mentioned earlier, a better ending would have been to see Louise show her full monster self and devour Evan and turn into her daughter. So, yeah, just disappointing. Film started out strong, interesting ideas, and then sort of lost itself along the way.
So, Steph, what was your favorite scene?
So, the scene I liked the best was Evan and Louise's first date. It's really nicely shot. It's at this little cafe outside by the sea, and the banter is great. The chemistry is good, and that's a testament to the strong writing that of the back and forth with these characters. Like an example is taking siestas is nice, but your iPhone wasn't invented in Europe. like that type of banner you had throughout their first date, and it really kept me interested in these characters. So, and it was just set really nicely on an evening in Italy. So, to me, that was definitely the best scene. What about you, Jeff?
I like the slow motion squares scene for the reasons that I already articulated. I just thought that worked really well as that interphase, or that moment that you're shifting from the real to the fantastic, and I thought that was just very well done. So, what was your least favorite scene?
So while I didn't love the slow mo scene, I didn't choose that one as my least favorite. The one I chose was their breakup scene. So Louise breaks up with Evan, and she's basically tells him she's not interested or ready at this point in her life for a relationship, which is sort of it's a classic reason that someone breaks up, right? It's just not ready for a relationship. Now, obviously there's a lot more reasons why in this case because she's about to rebirth herself, but what frustrated me about this scene is Evan then launches into, but you could be the love of my life, and it's only been several days, and it just makes him seem so desperate, so codependent. There's another scene following that where he breaks into her apartment. And yeah, that's where he sees some of the monster elements of her and helps save her and gives her the injection. But it's just in a normal environment that would have been really inappropriate boundary violation for someone you broke up with to break into your apartment, right? And so I just hated that scene because it just made me like Evan even less. What about you, Jeff?
While there were a number of scenes in the running, including the one you picked, I actually went with the entire Ugly American sequence. It was unnecessary, and it was so jarringly out of tone with the rest of the movie that it bugged me. It took me out of those moments. We already know she's dangerous. We have seen her eating a bunch of animals. She has claws and stuff. I didn't need to see her tear apart some dude who came out of a, National Lampoon European Vacation movie, basically.
And also, if you want to see her eating someone, go with my idea and save it till the finale and have her eat Evan.
So, Steph, what is your final panda rating for this movie?
So I gave it right in the middle, 2.5 pandas. It's worth watching for the witty dialogue, beautiful scenery, and it's an interesting story concept. Also, if you're looking for something a little different to watch on Valentine's Day this year, other than like your standard rom com, I mean, this is an interesting love story. So, for that reason, I think it's worth a watch, but it definitely lost points for how they developed the romance and everything that we've already talked about in terms of just 7 days she's going to fall in love with him, and that changes 2,000 years worth of her monster mutant cycle. So, but overall, I would still recommend watching it because it is unique and it's something different to watch on Valentine's Day this year. What about you, Jeff?
So I went with three gooey tentacle romance pandas. Most of my reasons, obviously, I've gone through. I would generally agree with your summation, though. I just thought elements of it worked a little more than you did. I think our big difference of opinion on this film is probably about Evan. I found him a bit more of a compelling, engaging character than I think you did. Even if by the end, I agree with you, the writers took him in an unfortunate direction. But overall, yeah, I think it's worth watching. It's an interesting, slightly above average genre mashup, and it's a decent romance with tentacles. So, yeah.
And for all of us that are stuck not being able to travel right now with the pandemic, it's nice to just imagine yourself getting lost in the Italian coast. One day we will be there again.
Thank you for joining us for Stream On. Tune in next week when we'll be reviewing Midnight Special, currently on Netflix. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Writes Media. Reproduction of this podcast without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2020.